They say your home is supposed to be your sanctuary, a place where you feel safe, secure. But for me, it became something else entirely, a prison, a stage, and a battleground against something I still can't fully explain. It all started one night when I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding as if I had been running for miles. The room was pitch dark, the kind of darkness where even your hands seemed to disappear. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the strange feeling that had pulled me from sleep. Then I saw it. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, a darker shadow in the corner of the room, tall and unmoving. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, but it was still there. I reached for my phone to shine its flashlight, but as the light flickered across the corner, there was nothing. The following nights were the same. I'd wake up at the exact same time, 3:12 a.m., and there it would be. The shadow never moved, never made a sound. It just stood there watching. I tried everything to rationalize it. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a piece of furniture casting an odd shadow. But no matter how I rearranged the room, the figure always appeared. By the fifth night, I couldn't take it anymore. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The shadow didn't respond. It didn't move. But the air in the room grew colder, and for the first time, I felt it, a presence. It wasn't just watching me. It was studying me. One evening, I decided to ignore the shadow and pretend it wasn't there. I stayed up late, working at my desk, refusing to look at the corner. At some point, I glanced at the mirror on my dresser, and my stomach dropped. In the reflection, the shadow wasn't in the corner. It was standing right behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My breath came in short gasps as I stared at the mirror. The shadow lingered there for a moment longer, then slowly faded, as if melting into the glass. Over the next few days, things got worse. I started noticing scratches on the walls, faint at first but growing deeper and more erratic. Strange sounds echoed through the house, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, as I lay in bed, the shadow moved for the first time. It stepped closer to me, its form becoming more defined. I could almost make out features, a head, shoulders, impossibly long arms. "Stay away!" I shouted, clutching the blanket like it was some kind of shield. The figure stopped, tilting its head as if it were amused. Then it vanished. Desperate for answers, I searched the house, trying to find anything that could explain what was happening. In the attic, I found an old box covered in dust. Inside were faded photographs of the house, taken decades ago. In every photo, there was a shadowy figure lurking in the background. My hands shook as I flipped through them. One image showed the figure standing in the same corner of my room, where I'd seen it. But what chilled me most was the last photo. It was of a family gathered around the dining table, smiling at the camera. Behind them, the shadow stood tall and clear, its featureless face turned toward the photographer. Written on the back of the photo was a single word, "Watcher." That night, I decided I couldn't live in fear anymore. I set up cameras around my room, determined to capture proof of what was happening. At 3:12 a.m., the shadow appeared again, standing in its usual spot. But this time, I didn't just watch. I turned on the lights, flooding the room with brightness. The shadow didn't disappear. Instead, it grew darker, more solid. "What do you want from me?" I demanded. The figure stepped forward, and for the first time it spoke. Its voice was a low, guttural rasp that seemed to echo inside my skull. "I am always here. I always have been. I always will be." Before I could react, the lights flickered and went out. The cameras all shut off simultaneously, leaving me in complete darkness. Then I felt it, cold, bony fingers wrapping around my wrist. I don't remember what happened after that. I woke up hours later, lying on the floor. The cameras were destroyed, their lenses shattered. The scratches on the walls were gone, but in their place was a single message carved deep into the plaster. "You belong to me now." The shadow hasn't appeared since that night, but I know it's not gone. I feel it, always just out of sight, watching me. Sometimes, I catch a glimpse of it in reflective surfaces, or hear faint whispers when the house is silent. And every night, without fail, I wake up at 3:12 a.m., my heart pounding, waiting for the shadow to return. I know it's only a matter of time. I'd always laughed at the cliche of checking under your bed before going to sleep. Monsters weren't real, I'd tell myself. They were just stories parents told to keep kids in line. But I've learned something horrifying in the past few weeks. Sometimes the stories are real. It started with the knocking. The first time I heard it, I thought it was coming from the wall. A dull, rhythmic knock knock knock, faint but persistent. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when the noise broke the silence. I sat up, staring at the wall, trying to convince myself it was the pipes or the house settling. But it didn't stop. Knock, knock, knock. I got up, turned on the lights, and inspected the wall, even tapping it with my knuckles. Nothing seemed out of place, and when I climbed back into bed, the sound was gone. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. The next night, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder and closer. I could feel the vibrations through the mattress, as if something was knocking directly under my bed. I froze, clutching the blanket, too afraid to move. The sound continued for what felt like hours before finally stopping. The next morning, I summoned the courage to check under the bed. It was empty, of course. Just dust bunnies and a stray sock. But something felt wrong. The air under the bed was colder, and I swore I could smell a faint metallic odor. By the third night, the knocking had turned into scratching. I woke up to the sound of nails, or claws, dragging against the wooden floor beneath my bed. I couldn't take it anymore. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The scratching stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from beneath the bed, I heard something that chilled me to my core. A soft, raspy voice whispered, "I see you." I bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, lights on, and the TV blaring. The following day, I called my best friend, Laura, and told her everything. She laughed it off, suggesting I might be dreaming or stressed. "You've been working too hard," she said. "You probably just need sleep." But that night, I didn't sleep at all. The noises didn't stop, but this time, they were joined by a low, guttural breathing. It was steady, slow, and unmistakably human. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling until dawn. The next day, I begged Laura to come over. I needed someone else to hear it, to prove I wasn't going insane. She agreed, reluctantly, and stayed over that night. At first, everything was quiet. We stayed up late talking, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was over. But then, at exactly 3 a.m., the knocking began. Laura's face went pale. "What the hell is that?" Before I could answer, the scratching joined in, followed by the breathing. We both sat frozen as the sounds grew louder, more insistent. And then, just as suddenly as they started, they stopped. "I'm checking," Laura said, grabbing her phone to use its flashlight. "Don't," I started, but it was too late. She leaned over the bed and shone the light underneath. For a moment, nothing happened. Then she screamed. I saw her drop the phone and scramble backward, her face twisted in terror. There's a man under your bed," she stammered, pointing with a shaking hand. I didn't dare look. Instead, I grabbed her arm, and we bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind us. We called the police, who arrived within minutes. 2 officers searched the house while we waited outside. When they emerged, they looked confused. "There's no one in there," one of them said. "But I saw him," Laura protested. "He was under the bed." The officers exchanged glances. We checked everywhere. The doors and windows were all locked from the inside. No one could have gotten in or out. Reluctantly, they left, and I was left with more questions than answers. Laura refused to stay another night, and I didn't blame her. I wanted to leave too, but something kept me there. A morbid curiosity, perhaps, or the hope that I could find some explanation. That night, I stayed up again, armed with a flashlight and a kitchen knife. At 3 a.m., the noises returned. But this time, they weren't under the bed. They were in the bed. I felt it before I heard it. The mattress shifted, as if someone was lying beside me. My heart stopped as I turned my head slowly. There, on the pillow next to mine, was a face. It wasn't human. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its skull, its eyes sunken and black as coal. It grinned at me with jagged teeth, and its breath reeked of rot. "I told you," it rasped, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. "I see you." I don't remember screaming. I don't remember running. All I know is that when I woke up, I was outside, lying on the lawn in the early morning light. I never went back into that house. But sometimes when I lie in bed at night, I feel a cold breath on my neck. And I hear it. I still see you. I always hated the closet in my bedroom. It wasn't because it was particularly creepy or out of place. It was just too big, too deep, and too dark. The door didn't shut all the way, leaving a thin sliver of darkness that seemed to stare at me while I lay in bed. As a kid, I'd always imagined something living in there, something waiting for me to fall asleep. But as I grew up, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Monsters weren't real, and the closet was just a closet. At least, that's what I thought. The first time I noticed something strange, I chalked it up to the house settling. It was a quiet night, and I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone when I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from the closet. I froze, my eyes darting to the cracked door. The sound stopped, and for a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. Then it started again. I sat up, my heart pounding. "Hello!" I called out, feeling ridiculous for talking to an empty closet. Silence. I got up, hesitated, and then walked over to the door. My hand hovered over the knob for a moment before I swung it open. Nothing. Just a pile of clothes and some old boxes. I sighed in relief, but as I turned to go back to bed, I felt it, a faint gust of cold air brushing against the back of my neck. A few nights later, the sound returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. I tried to ignore it, pulling the covers over my head like a child. But then I heard something else, whispering. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with each passing second. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unsettling, like a voice trying to crawl into my brain. I sat up, clutching my blanket. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. The whispering stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. I stared at the closet, waiting for something to happen, and then the door creaked open. I didn't remember leaving the door ajar. It had been closed earlier, hadn't it? The darkness inside the closet seemed deeper, almost alive. As I stared into it, I saw something shift, a shadow moving against the blackness. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a trick of the light. Something was in there. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it into the closet. The beam of light illuminated the empty space, and I let out a shaky laugh. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, closing the door firmly. But as I turned off the flashlight and climbed back into bed, I swore I heard it again. This time it sounded closer. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The inside of the closet door was covered in scratches. They weren't there before, I was sure of it. The marks were deep, jagged, as if made by claws. I ran my fingers over them, a shiver running down my spine. That night, I placed a chair in front of the closet door, determined to keep it shut. It didn't help. I woke up to the sound of the chair scraping across the floor. My eyes flew open, and I saw the closet door slowly swinging open, the chair tipping over as if it had been pushed. A figure stood in the doorway. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long, and its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, and its eyes, if you could call them that, were empty black voids. It stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The figure reached out a long, bony hand, its fingers curling toward me. "You let me in," it rasped, its voice low and guttural. I scrambled backward, falling off the bed and hitting the floor. When I looked up, the figure was gone, and the closet door was shut. I decided to sleep in the living room after that. I couldn't bear to be in the bedroom, not with that thing still lurking in the closet. But it didn't matter where I went. The whispering followed me, growing louder and more insistent. The scratching started on the walls, the ceiling, even the floors. One night, as I lay on the couch, I felt a weight pressing down on my chest. I opened my eyes and saw it, the figure looming over me, its face inches from mine. "You can't escape," it whispered. "You're mine now." I screamed, and the world went black. I woke up in my bed, the sunlight streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare. But when I turned to look at the closet, the door was open. Inside, the scratches had multiplied, forming words that chilled me to my core. "I'm still here." I've always loved the peace and quiet of my house at night. Living in a rural area surrounded by woods, the nights are dark and still, with nothing but the occasional sound of crickets or rustling leaves. It was comforting until the night I saw it. It started as an ordinary night. I was curled up on the couch, reading, with only a small lamp casting a warm glow in the living room. The large window behind me overlooked the forest, but I kept the curtains open. I liked the view of the trees swaying gently in the breeze. Around midnight, I decided to head to bed. As I turned off the lamp, the room was plunged into darkness, save for the faint moonlight spilling through the window. That's when I saw it. A face, pale and expressionless, pressed against the glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The face didn't move. It just stared, its hollow eyes fixed on me. I thought it might be a trick of the light, a reflection, or maybe even an animal. Summoning every ounce of courage, I took a step closer to the window. The face vanished. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring out into the dark woods. There was nothing but trees and shadows. Eventually, I convinced myself it was my imagination and went to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I noticed something strange. The glass on the window was smeared as if something, or someone, had pressed their face and hands against it. Worse, there were scratches. Long, deep scratches etched into the glass. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Animals don't leave marks like that. That night, I closed all the curtains before turning off the lights. I didn't want to see the face again. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening as the tapping grew louder and more insistent. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the living room, using the flashlight to guide me. The tapping stopped as soon as I entered the room. I hesitated before pulling the curtain aside, just a fraction. The face was there, staring back at me. But this time it smiled, a warning ignored. I slammed the curtain shut and spent the rest of the night huddled on the couch, every light in the house turned on. By morning, the face was gone, but the scratches on the window were deeper. I called a friend and told them everything. They laughed it off, suggesting it was a prank or maybe just my overactive imagination. But then I noticed something else. The marks weren't just on the outside of the window. They were on the inside too. It comes closer. Over the next few nights, the tapping continued. Sometimes it came from the living room window, other times from the kitchen or even my bedroom. I stopped opening the curtains altogether, but I could feel it, whatever it was, watching me. One night, I heard footsteps outside, slow, deliberate, circling the house. The sound stopped beneath my bedroom window, and then I heard it, a faint whisper. "I see you." I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed a bag and made plans to leave the house the next day. But that night, the tapping turned into pounding. Bang, bang, bang. It was coming from every window, all at once. The house shook with the force of it, and I could hear the whispers, louder now, overlapping each other. "You can't leave. You're mine. Let me in." The pounding stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was even worse. I stood in the middle of the room, clutching a kitchen knife, when I heard the voice again. It was right behind me. I'm already inside. I don't remember what happened after that. When I woke up, it was morning, and I was lying on the floor. The windows were shattered, glass scattered everywhere. But the worst part was the walls. They were covered in scratches, deep and jagged, forming words that made my blood run cold. "You can't escape." I left the house that day and never went back. But even now, in my new apartment, I sometimes hear tapping at the window late at night. And when I'm brave enough to look, I swear I see it. The face, still smiling. Mirrors never scared me. I'd always thought they were just reflections, harmless replicas of reality. But that was before the night my reflection moved, and I didn't. It started when I inherited an antique mirror from my grandmother. She had always been a collector of strange things, and this mirror was no exception. It was large and ornate, with a thick, gilded frame covered in strange, twisting patterns that almost looked like faces. I didn't want it, but my mom insisted I take it. "It's a family heirloom," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. I hung it in my bedroom, propped against the wall across from my bed. It was old and slightly warped, the glass distorting my reflection just enough to make it unsettling. But I convinced myself it was fine. Just a mirror. Nothing to be afraid of. The first strange thing happened about a week after I brought the mirror home. I was brushing my hair before bed, staring into the glass, when I noticed it. My reflection blinked, but I hadn't. I froze, staring at the mirror, waiting for it to happen again. But my reflection just stared back at me, perfectly normal. I shook it off, telling myself it was just my tired eyes playing tricks on me. A few nights later, I woke up to a faint sound. It was coming from the mirror. At first, it was barely audible, like the hum of an old TV. But as I listened, it grew louder, and I realized it wasn't a hum, it was whispering. Dozens of voices, all overlapping, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I sat up in bed, staring at the mirror, and the whispering stopped. That's when I saw it. A shadow, deep in the glass, moving behind my reflection. I started avoiding the mirror after that, throwing a sheet over it and keeping the lights on at night. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me. One night, I was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard it again. The whispering. This time it was louder. I turned to look at the mirror, and the sheet was gone. My reflection stared back at me, but something was wrong. It wasn't me. Not exactly. The face in the mirror was mine, but the eyes were different, too dark, too wide, too hungry. It smiled at me, a slow, crooked grin that made my stomach churn. And then it raised a hand and waved. I wasn't moving. Panicked, I grabbed the nearest object, a book, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards falling to the floor with a deafening crash. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I heard it. A soft, wet scraping sound, like something crawling across the broken glass. I backed away as a hand emerged from the shattered frame. It was pale, skeletal, with fingers too long and too many joints. The thing pulled itself out of the mirror, its body contorting unnaturally as it climbed into my room. It stood there, staring at me with my face but not my eyes. "Your turn," it whispered, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. I ran, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I could hear it laughing, the sound echoing in my ears as I bolted out of the house. When I returned the next morning with a friend, the mirror was gone. The room was empty, save for the shards of glass on the floor. But sometimes when I pass by a reflective surface, a window, a puddle, even a shiny piece of metal, I see it. The other me staring back, waiting,